Ancient Rome, a mighty empire whose greatness we are accustomed to praise, was not only full of magnificent triumphs and ingenious engineering solutions. Behind the gleam of gold and marble was a dark but essential part of Roman society: slavery. Millions of people captured in wars or born in captivity formed the backbone of the Roman economy, doing the hardest and most thankless work. Their lives were filled with deprivation, humiliation, and constant fear. But what if I told you that even in this seemingly hopeless situation, the slaves found incredible, sometimes desperate ways to break free? What motivated them? Did they have any hope of success? And why, despite their desperate attempts, did the vast majority never manage to gain the desired freedom? Get ready to dive into a world where every day was a struggle for survival, and the dream of freedom was stronger than any fear. When we think of a slave's escape, we think of fast-paced chases, secret trails, and battles for survival. However, some slaves, especially those who were quite intelligent and observant, tried to use completely different, much more subtle and sophisticated methods. They did not run physically, but tried to escape within the system by manipulating laws and customs. How did they manage this? And why did such an escape end up being a trap? The answer will amaze you. One of these methods was to try to gain the patronage of an influential Roman. A slave might try to impress a high-ranking guest of his master by showing extraordinary loyalty, a sharp mind, or a rare talent. He might have hoped that this powerful man, seeing its merits, would want to buy it back from the current owner. Sometimes slaves even took risks by reporting plots against their masters or revealing valuable information, hoping that their loyalty would be rewarded with freedom or at least an improvement in their situation. However, such an escape was extremely rare and unreliable. A powerful Roman might have been able to buy a slave, but that only meant a change of master, not complete freedom. Moreover, such a move required a huge risk. If the attempt failed, the slave would be severely punished. Another option is an attempt to escape under the guise of a free person. This was only possible for slaves who had certain skills or appearances that allowed them to blend in with the crowd. For example, slave scribes, stewards, or artisans with skills might try to pass themselves off as freedmen or even born freemen. They may have forged documents or simply relied on their own courage and luck, hoping that they would not be recognized. But why couldn't even slave intellectuals who knew the language and customs retain this freedom? Because Rome was a society where status was determined at birth or by legal act. Anyone who could prove that a person was a slave could capture them. In addition, branding, tattoos, or even a lack of civil rights, for example, the ability to file a lawsuit, quickly gave the fugitive away. Another clever method was to try to escape through the judicial system. If the owner was particularly violent, in theory there were laws that could protect slaves from excessive cruelty, but in practice they were rarely enforced. The slave could try to appeal to the magistrate or even the emperor if he could get to them. However, it was incredibly risky and almost always ended in failure. Judges usually sided with the owners, and an attempt to complain about the owner could be considered a riot and lead to immediate execution. These clever escape attempts, while seemingly less dramatic than open rebellion, were just as dangerous, if not more so, and rarely resulted in real, long-term freedom. When the slaves realized the hopelessness of life in the Roman Empire, some of them, especially those who lived in the border provinces, turned their eyes outside the Roman possessions, to the so-called barbarian lands. This seemed logical. If there is no freedom in Rome, perhaps there is freedom where there are no Roman laws. But why couldn't even the most remote and wild lands guarantee their freedom and safety? And what was the main trap of such an escape? The answer will shock you. The first thing that escaped slaves encountered on their way to the borders was the incredible difficulties of crossing. The empire's borders were heavily guarded by legions, and crossing mountains, rivers, and forests without maps, supplies, or knowledge of the terrain was a deadly undertaking. Many died of starvation, cold, disease, or in fights with wild animals. But even if they managed to overcome these obstacles, they were faced with new and equally terrible challenges. Moving to barbaric territories did not automatically mean gaining freedom. First, many barbarian tribes especially those bordering Rome, actively traded slaves with the Romans themselves or used them for their own needs. Runaway slaves could simply be captured by these tribes and sold back into slavery, either back to Rome or to other regions. The situation of such a barbarian slave could have been even worse than in Rome, since Roman law, although sparse, still regulated some aspects of the attitude towards slaves. In the barbarian lands, there were no such guarantees at all. Second, even if the fugitives managed to assimilate with a particular tribe, their lives were still incredibly difficult. They were strangers, ignorant of the language, customs, and culture. They had to relearn how to survive in the wild, fight for their place in the tribal hierarchy, and constantly fear retribution from Rome. The Romans often organized punitive expeditions outside their borders to recover runaway slaves or punish those who harbored them. Treaties with barbarian tribes often included rendition clauses, making even the most remote corners of the world unsafe for Roman slaves. Finally, there was the psychological trap. Many slaves who grew up in Roman culture could not adapt to a completely different way of life. The lack of the usual infrastructure, food, social connections, all this created insurmountable difficulties. They might be free from the shackle of slavery, but they were prisoners of a new, alien, and hostile environment. Therefore, fleeing to the barbarian lands was more an act of desperation than a deliberate plan to gain long-term freedom. Roman cities, especially Rome itself, were huge megacities with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. It would seem that in such a crowd you can easily get lost, become invisible, and start a new life. Many slaves, especially those who worked in the cities, tried to use this anonym to their advantage. But why, even in this anthill of freedom, were their attempts doomed? And how did Rome turn the urban environment itself into a trap for fugitives? Discover the truth that will change your image of Rome. The first thing that a runaway slave encountered in the city was the lack of documents and means of subsistence. In Roman society, any free person had certain rights and, as a rule, some means. The slave, on the other hand, had nothing but clothes on his body and possibly stolen coins. Without money, it was impossible to rent a house, buy food, and even more so, to change your appearance or leave the city. Any attempt to get a job without recommendations or documents aroused suspicion. The second is universal control and a system of denunciations. Rome was a police state. There was a well-developed network of wardens, informers, and even private slave hunters who made money from catching fugitives. Roman citizens, especially small proprietors, were required to report any suspicious person. Slaves were not allowed to move freely around the city without their master's escort or special permission. Anyone who looked confused, too well or too poorly dressed, or simply didn't fit their intended status could be stopped and questioned. The third is the appearance, features, and branding. Many slaves had distinctive markings. Brands, for example, effug, fugitivus, fugitive, tattooed on the forehead, or a badge on the neck with the master's name. Even if there were no such obvious marks, slave labor left traces on the body, calluses, scars, a special gait. Moreover, many slaves were brought from different parts of the empire and had ethnic features in their appearance or accent that could give them away. Slaves often wore special clothing or hairstyles that distinguished them from free people. Trying to change one's appearance without the means and skills was incredibly difficult. The fourth is social connections. A runaway slave, in fact, had no one to trust. The other slaves were afraid to inform, but it was also dangerous to help the fugitives. Free people, with rare exceptions, did not risk harboring runaway slaves, as this was punishable by law. In a huge city where everyone cared only for themselves, the runaway slave found himself in absolute isolation. The illusion of anonymity was quickly dispelled by the brutal reality of constant surveillance and lack of rights. The idea of uniting to fight for freedom has always been in the air among the oppressed. And Roman slaves, despite all the risks, sometimes tried to create secret societies and organize conspiracies. Spartak is the most famous, but not the only example of such resistance. Why, despite such desperate courage, were these plots almost always doomed to failure? And what prevented the slaves from forming an effective force? The answer may seem trivial, but it explains the failures. Watch the video below. The first and main reason for the failure is the total system of snitching and espionage. Slave owners were well aware of the potential threat of revolts and created a network of informants. Often the slaves themselves, in exchange for privileges or even the illusion of freedom, became informers, reporting suspicious conversations and actions. Slaves belonging to the same master often came from different tribes and spoke different languages, which made it difficult for them to unite and created distrust. In addition, the master specifically bought slaves from different regions to prevent cohesion. The second reason is the lack of a single leader and strategy. Even if a few slaves conspired, it was extremely rare for them to find a charismatic leader who could organize thousands of people, create a clear plan of action, and provide supplies and weapons. Revolts were often spontaneous, poorly coordinated, and easily suppressed by the Roman authorities. The Roman army, disciplined and well-armed, was always ready to put down any rebellion. The third reason is the lack of resources and weapons. Slaves had no access to weapons, and their combat skills were often minimal unless they were gladiators. They had to fight with whatever they had at hand: agricultural implements, rocks, and makeshift clubs. Against well-trained and well-armed legionnaires with superior tactics and equipment, they had no chance. Even in the case of Spartacus, his army, though large, consisted mostly of untrained fighters who were opposed by a professional Roman army. And finally, the fourth reason is psychological pressure and fear. The slaves lived in constant fear of harsh punishments. For attempting to escape or participating in a conspiracy, they would face a painful death, crucifixion, burning alive, or being hunted by wild animals. This fear was so strong that it suppressed the will to resist of most slaves. Even successful uprisings tended to end in violent reprisals that served as a lesson to everyone else. Thus, despite the desperate desire for freedom, secret societies and conspiracies were usually just unrealized dreams. When all paths to freedom seemed closed and life in slavery became unbearable, some slaves resorted to extreme, most desperate measures: suicide or murder of their master. This was not an attempt to escape in the usual sense, but rather an act of utter hopelessness and despair. But why was even such a radical freedom really just another trap that only served to strengthen the system they were fighting against? The answer at the end of the video will shock you. Suicide was for the slave not just a way out of suffering, but also an act of protest. A slave who took his own life deprived his master of valuable property, causing him financial damage and possibly even reputational damage. However, this was only an illusion of victory. Roman law considered the suicide of a slave as a crime against his master, and sometimes the family of the deceased could be punished. The main thing is that suicide did not change the system. It only confirmed her cruelty and showed that the only way out for a slave was death. Moreover, examples of suicide, although acts of personal desperation, rarely inspired other slaves to fight, because they only promised more hopelessness. Killing the master was an even rarer and far more dangerous act. In some cases, if the master was excessively cruel, the slave could go to the limit and decide to kill. This was not only a personal revenge, but also an attempt to get rid of the source of suffering. However, Roman law punished such acts with extreme cruelty. If a slave killed his master, then according to the law, Lex Cornelia de Sicarius et Beneficius, all slaves who were in the house at the time of the murder, even if they had nothing to do with it, could be executed. This cruel law was designed to create collective responsibility and maintain fear among the slaves, so that they themselves would prevent such actions, fearing for their lives and the lives of their comrades. History knows cases when hundreds or even thousands of slaves were executed after the murder of the master. For example, in 61 AD, the prefect of Rome, Pedanius Secundus, was killed by one of his slaves. In response, the Senate decided to execute all 400 slaves belonging to the state, despite popular protests. It was a show of intimidation designed to demonstrate the absolute power of Rome over the slaves. Thus, the suicide and murder of the master, while acts of extreme desperation, were just another trap that slaves, who were unable to escape from the cycle of violence and oppression, would fall into. They only strengthened the very system against which they were directed and did not lead to true freedom. Not all slaves resorted to open rebellion or desperate acts of suicide. Many chose the path of slow, hidden resistance, trying to undermine the system from within through pretense, sabotage, and imitation of work. These were a kind of passive escapes, the purpose of which was not to physically escape, but to minimize suffering and cause damage to the host. How did the Romans deal with such invisible enemies? And why did even the most cunning saboteurs end up losing? Look, this is very important. Pretending to be ill or incompetent was one of the most common tactics. A slave could feign illness to avoid hard work or get an easier task. They may have pretended to be stupid, clumsy, or unable to perform complex tasks in order to be reassigned to a less responsible position, or simply stopped expecting too much from them. This allowed you to save energy and avoid grueling work. However, the owners were not fools. They had their own methods of testing: severe corporal punishment for those who pretended, or the use of slave doctors who could expose the pretender. Repeated exposure led to even harsher punishments. Sabotage and property damage were more risky, but were sometimes used. Slaves could intentionally break tools, spoil crops, lose important documents, or forget to follow instructions. The goal was to cause economic damage to the owner, express their dissatisfaction, or simply revenge. For example, slaves in villas could spoil wine or olive oil by adding sewage to them. However, every such act was incredibly dangerous. For damage to the slave's property, severe punishments were expected, including death. Supervisors were vigilant, and any incident was investigated, and the culprit, if found, was subjected to demonstrative punishment. Imitation of work and slowing down the pace, this was a ubiquitous phenomenon. The slaves tried to work as slowly as possible, giving the appearance of being diligent, but actually expending a minimum of effort. It was a kind of silent resistance, a way to conserve energy and protest against their fate. This was very difficult to prove and punish, but the owners and supervisors constantly monitored the performance. Any significant reduction in the pace of work could result in beatings or other punishments. Despite the apparent safety of such methods, they were still part of the vicious circle of slavery. These actions did not lead to freedom, but only allowed us to temporarily alleviate suffering or cause a little damage to the owner. But in the end, a slave was still a slave, and the risk of being caught and severely punished always hung over him. It was a constant, debilitating internal conflict that rarely brought real liberation. For many slaves, the only real hope of freedom was ransom or emancipation. Unlike open escapes, these paths were legal, but extremely difficult and often only changed one form of addiction to another. Why did even gaining freedom through ransom not always mean a happy ending? And why did former slaves often find themselves in a new, invisible trap? Watch the video to the end and find out the shocking truth about the life of freedmen. Ransom, peculium, was one of the few legal paths to freedom. The master could allow the slave to accumulate small personal savings peculi. This money could be earned by extra labor, alms, or even small-scale trading. However, first of all, the peculium formally remained the property of the owner, and he could confiscate it at any time. Second, the amount required for the ransom was huge and often too much for the slave. Even if the slave managed to accumulate funds, the master could simply refuse to let him go if the slave was too valuable. Freedman, manumitio, was the act of granting freedom by a master. This could happen for several reasons. Merit. A slave could receive freedom for long and faithful service, special achievements, or saving the master's life. Will. The master could grant freedom to the slave in his will. Mercy. The master could simply free the slave of his own free will. Fictitious marriage. Sometimes female slaves were freed to marry their master, which gave them and their children freedom. Special cases. For example, if the slave raised the master's children. However, even freedmen did not mean complete freedom in the modern sense. The freedman became a client of his former master, now called the patron. He had new responsibilities, providing for the patron. The freedman had to support the patron financially if he needed it. Rendering of services. He had to perform certain works or render services to the patron, for example, accompany him in public places. Marriage restrictions. A freedman could have restrictions on marriage, especially with senators. Inheritance. Often the patron could claim a part of the freedman's inheritance. Thus, the former slave did not become a completely free citizen. He was in a new form of dependence, which, although better than slavery, still limited his rights and freedoms. It was a golden cage, or rather silver chains. Many freedmen had to work hard to ensure their existence and fulfill their duties to the patron. In fact, working for him for free. Their lives were often devoted to serving their former master, which only prolonged the cycle of addiction, even if the physical shackles were removed. The sea is an infinite space, a symbol of freedom in unexplored horizons. For some desperate slaves, the Mediterranean seemed like the perfect escape route. Escape on a ship, sail away to distant lands where there are no Roman laws and slaveholders. A dream that beckoned many. But why did the sea routes, instead of the promised freedom, often lead slaves to an even more terrible fate than the one from which they fled? This is a story you've never been told in textbooks. The first and most obvious problem is access to the ship. A slave couldn't just come to the port and buy a ticket. He had to either steal a ship, which was almost impossible, or sneak aboard a merchant or fishing ship. But Roman ports were heavily guarded, and ships were carefully inspected. Any stranger on the ship was suspicious. If a slave was found on board, he was immediately returned to his master and severely punished. The second problem is pirates. The Mediterranean Sea in antiquity was teeming with pirates. For a runaway slave, the encounter with pirates was a nightmare. Far from freeing them, the pirates were interested in capturing any individual to sell them as slaves. The Roman government fought piracy, but it was never completely eradicated. Thus, a slave who escaped from one master could fall into the hands of pirates and be sold into slavery again, perhaps in even more brutal conditions. The pirates were not interested in freedom or justice, only in profit. The third problem is the dangers of sea travel. Even on a legitimate merchant ship, life was full of risks. Storms, shipwrecks, and diseases were all common parts of marine life. The runaway slave, who had no experience of navigation, was completely defenseless against the elements. He also lacked supplies, water, and survival skills on the high seas. And finally, the fourth problem is the lack of safe havens. Even if a slave managed to reach some land, he was still in danger outside of Rome. Other states and tribes, as already mentioned, often cooperated with Rome in the extradition of runaway slaves, or were themselves slave owners. Traveling by sea, which seemed to be the way to freedom, was in reality only a road to the unknown, full of new dangers and perhaps even more terrible slavery. In the most desperate cases, some slaves, especially those who lived in border areas or were captured during military operations, might decide to go over to the side of the enemy of Rome. It was a paradoxical choice: to fight against the empire that had once been their home and to fight for freedom in a foreign land. But why did even such a seemingly radical step toward freedom often only result in a change of master for another? And why did former Roman slaves rarely find true refuge among Rome's enemies? The answer is at the end, and it will shock you. For slaves trapped in border areas during conflicts, going over to the side of barbarians or other enemies of Rome seemed logical. The enemies of Rome could promise them freedom, land, or even a place in their ranks. There are cases when Spartacus, for example, tried to negotiate with the Cilician pirates about the transportation of his people. And during the Punic Wars, some slaves fled to the Carthaginians, hoping for a better fate. However, these promises were rarely fulfilled. First, the enemies of Rome also often practiced slavery. Instead of giving the slaves their freedom, they could simply use them as cheap labor or sell them on. So, for example, the Goths, Celts, or Germanic tribes, although they did not have such a developed slave system as Rome, still captured prisoners and used their labor. A Roman slave who found himself in their possession might encounter a completely alien culture, language, and even more primitive living conditions. Second, relations with Rome's former enemies were extremely unstable. Today's allies might become enemies tomorrow, and then the former slaves would be in an even more dangerous position. They could have been given to Rome as part of peace treaties or simply sold for profit. Third, Rome never forgot or forgave. Runaway slaves who went over to the enemy were considered traitors and were subject to unconditional execution if caught. The Roman authorities made great efforts to recover them, seeing in them not only a loss of property, but also a blow to the prestige of the empire. Rima's armies were capable of waging long and bloody wars to recapture their fugitives. Thus, entering the service of the enemy was just another form of desperate attempt to find freedom, which almost never led to the desired result. Slaves changed hands and often found themselves in even more unpredictable and dangerous conditions, only confirming that in a world ruled by Rome, freedom was an almost unattainable dream for those born in chains. The Roman Empire was a true superpower of its time, with an incredibly developed infrastructure, a network of roads, ports, cities, a system of government and justice. Paradoxically, this development has become one of the main obstacles for runaway slaves. Why did the very things that made Rome great become the main trap for those who dreamed of freedom? You can't even imagine how the Roman Empire squeezed its slaves. The Roman roads, the famous Via Appia, Via Flaminia, and others were a marvel of engineering, allowing legions and goods to move quickly throughout the empire. But for a runaway slave, these roads were a death trap. They were well patrolled, with inns and stations where any suspicious person could be spotted. It was almost impossible to travel through them unnoticed. The fugitive, forced to hide in the forests and mountains, faced enormous difficulties and dangers, wasting time and energy. Systema Pravosudia Rome's justice system was comprehensive. Any person in the empire, whether free or slave, was subject to Roman law. There was a well-developed judicial system, as well as a network of informants and government officials who could detain a suspicious person. There was no place for a slave where Roman law did not apply. The cities and provinces of the empire were closely connected. Information about escaped slaves spread quickly. In every city, in every settlement, there were local authorities who cooperated with the central government. Lists of runaway slaves and descriptions of them were created, which made it much more difficult to disguise them. And finally, the mentality of Roman society. Roman society was deeply hierarchical, and slavery was its foundation. Virtually every free citizen considered slavery the natural order of things and was willing to cooperate with the authorities in catching fugitives. The lack of empathy and ubiquitous sense of threat made every step of the runaway slave incredibly dangerous. This all-encompassing network of controls from the roads to every citizen created an impenetrable trap from which it was almost impossible to escape. A journey into the world of Roman slavery revealed the brutal reality and incredible obstacles faced by those who desperately sought freedom. We saw that escapes, whether by stratagem, through barbarian lands, in urban crowds, through plots, acts of desperation, or sea routes, were almost always doomed to failure. A comprehensive system of control, harsh punishments, lack of support, and total isolation made the dream of freedom almost unattainable. The stories of these slaves are not just dark pages of the past. They serve as a powerful reminder of the price of freedom and of human resilience in the face of unbearable challenges. We see how, even in the most hopeless conditions, people continue to look for a way out, even if most often unsuccessfully. We hope that this dive into the dark corners of Roman history has helped you take a fresh look at this great civilization and its paradoxes. If you like this video and want to learn even more about the little-known but incredibly fascinating aspects of history, be sure to subscribe to our channel and put a like. What other aspects of ancient Rome or other civilizations would you like to explore? Share your ideas in the comments. We are always interested in your opinion, and we will be happy to continue our journey to the past.